Well, welcome again, and thank you so much for coming to our webinar today, How to Become a Sanctuary Community 101, organized by the Synod of the Northeast. My name is Kim Deal, and on behalf of the Synod, I will be the organizer for today's webinar. Before I get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. Next slide, please. By default, you are listening to this webinar using your computer's speaker system. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed. Next slide, please. Please make an effort to reduce the outside sounds that could be distracting for others on the call if there is a time on the call when you are not muted. Next slide, please. Please submit questions today for today's panelists by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during a Q&A time at the end of this webinar. I would now like to introduce Emily Brewer, who will moderate today's webinar. Emily?
Thanks, Kim. Hey, everybody. My name is Emily Brewer, and I am the Executive Director of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. And I wanted to say welcome to this webinar. We're really glad that you all could join us. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, the Synod of the Northeast, and the National Sanctuary Movement. And this is part of an effort to, especially in the Synod of the Northeast, to raise awareness and help train communities about sanctuary. And so if you are in the Northeast and are interested in being part of a network around sanctuary, we hope that you will stay in touch with the Synod. And we'll have more information at the end of this webinar about next steps. So like Kim said, we will have time for questions at the end, so please submit your questions through the chat box. And it would help us if you put your name first and then your question, and I will help moderate those. I want to introduce you to our panelists for today. We have Reverend John Fife, who is a retired Presbyterian minister who helped found the sanctuary movement in the 1980s while he was pastoring Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona. He continues to live in Tucson and is still very active in No More Deaths, No Mas Muertes, of which he is a co-founder. AmyBeth Willis is an organizer for the National Sanctuary Movement. She was a young adult volunteer with the Presbyterian Church and lives in Tucson, Arizona. Our third panelist will be Reverend Jim Rigby, who is a Presbyterian minister in Austin, Texas. For the last 9 months, his community, St. Andrew's Presbyterian, has given sanctuary to a Guatemalan family of Hilda and Ivan. And our final panelist will be Reverend Allison Harrington, who is the current pastor of Southside Presbyterian Church, where she has been serving since 2008. Her church helped reignite the sanctuary movement when Daniel Ruiz took sanctuary in May of 2014. You may also recognize her name from when she was recently arrested for civil disobedience as part of a clergy action protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline in November. So we are so grateful to have all of these folks with us, and we're grateful that you are joining us. Again, my name is Emily, and I'll be moderating the panel and helping us move through and get to questions. You may have noticed that we have a slight delay with our slides, so please just bear with us. And like I said, all of this will be available at the end of the webinar. We'll send that out, and more information about next steps will be covered at the end of the webinar. So John Fife, if you're there, we'll turn it over to you.
I'm here and delighted to be with you all. Let me begin by talking about the ancient tradition of sanctuary. There's recently been some research done that establishes that sanctuary is one of the most ancient traditions globally in almost every part of the globe and in almost every culture. It it says that sacred sites for all faith communities has been a place of refuge and protection for people who are victims of some sort of threat to their life or security of their person. And in Hebrew scriptures, of course, it's cited that God established cities of sanctuary, and that expanded to sacred sites in Hebrew tradition. And then when Constantine declared the Roman Empire Christian, churches took over that function from what had been temples and sacred sites in the Roman Empire. And so churches became places of sanctuary for people who were literally fleeing for their lives. And then in the Holy Roman Empire, and it got enshrined in the Middle Ages in law that designated churches as places of sanctuary throughout Europe. We appropriated that tradition in the 1980s when we had different context on the border and in the United States. Then the people we were seeking to protect in the church as sanctuary were Central American refugees fleeing the death squads and the torture chambers and the massacres of villages in Central America, and the United States government, for politicized reasons, was not recognizing them as refugees. And so in 1982, we publicly announced that Southside Presbyterian Church would be a sanctuary for refugees from Central America. And that eventually grew into a movement that I'll talk about in a moment. The basic thesis is that throughout history, the basic way in which cultures and societies protected victims who were fleeing for their lives was to designate sacred sites as places of sanctuary. And then with the rise of nation states, that responsibility got transferred to the nation state to enshrine the function of asylum to law in nation states. And the basic thesis for the need for sanctuary now is that nation states have failed in their designated responsibility to provide asylum for refugees and people whose very lives are threatened by circumstances, war, environmental devastation, genocide, all kinds of things. And now the need for sanctuary arises because nation states have failed in their responsibility to provide asylum. Now, the context is that we believe, and churches and faith communities throughout Europe and globally now understand that in their context, the nation state has failed, or we anticipate that nation state is going to fail. And the sanctuary idea, tradition, has grown here at Southside Church and throughout the country and throughout Europe, as clearly nation states have failed in that responsibility. So in the 80s, we initiated the idea of the church as sanctuary to protect Central American refugees. What happened was a movement grew throughout the United States that resulted in 500 and some congregations publicly declaring sanctuary. Hundreds of others were involved in the Underground Railroad and just non-public protection of refugees from Central America. Cities, 17 cities became cities of sanctuary: New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Detroit, other medium-sized cities. Colleges and universities got the idea and declared sanctuary. Stanford University was the first, and lots of other public and private colleges and universities followed. And what was accomplished was that eventually the United States gave temporary protected status to all undocumented Salvadorans and Guatemalans in the United States at that time, gave them work permits, stopped all deportations to El Salvador and Guatemala, and agreed to a whole series of reforms of the political asylum process. So what did we learn out of all that? First of all, we learned that the church and the synagogue can be an effective base for active nonviolent resistance to government violations of human rights. Exactly the function that traditionally faith communities and sacred sites have provided as sanctuary. Secondly, that the church is a global institution capable of forming effective relationships to protect the poor and the persecuted across national borders. It was our connection with the church in El Salvador and Guatemala and Mexico that resulted in the effective work that we were able to do here in the United States in providing sanctuary. I think thirdly that the church has a fundamental responsibility to protect the victims of human rights violations, both legally and morally. We called it civil initiative, not civil disobedience, because we believed that the defense of victims of human rights violations is not an act of civil disobedience. It is legal and moral responsibility that all of civil society has, but particularly given our scriptural traditions, the church and faith communities have a particular responsibility within the whole of civil society. And that lastly, by entering into sanctuary, into protective community with the poor and refugees and migrants, the church becomes spiritually transformed. It is that relationship and occupying the same position as the persecuted, as the other, that the church enters into relationship with what the Christian scriptures call the essentially blessedness of the poor, and that relationship which transforms the church spiritually. So our experience was that we may have saved a lot of lives during the 80s, but they saved our soul. So I commend that spiritual transformation to you all. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. And next from AmyBeth, who's a national organizer with the National Sanctuary Movement. AmyBeth?
Hi, everyone. So following what John was saying, really this work and the spiritual transformation of people of faith didn't stop once the crises in Central America had died down, and didn't stop once we had achieved a win in the sense of people being able to stay here and be able to regularize their status. And so these faith communities continue to be involved and to be in relationship with immigrant communities And so this really, as circumstances changed and as the context changed, it meant that these faith communities had to adapt and had to continue to be in relationship with immigrant communities to find out really what the new context was and how best to be in solidarity with those communities. So as you're looking at these pictures here, in around 2006 and 2007, these big cities that had been involved in the work of the 80s really kind of reestablished their sanctuary networks, and they dubbed themselves the New Sanctuary Movement. So in cities like New York City, Philadelphia, Portland, Denver, Chicago, really began to grow networks again of people of faith working alongside their immigrant neighbors to advocate for justice. And this work continued in a variety of ways, both in the accompaniment of immigrants who were facing going to court and looking at deportation, to accompanying asylum seekers and refugees, to advocating for changes in our immigration policies, particularly around efforts in 2006 and 2007 for comprehensive immigration reform. And so this work continued, and coalitions began to develop and grow around the nation for people of faith to really continue to say that they stand with immigrant communities and with the wonderful contributions that these communities bring to our society. So fast forwarding a little, in May of 2014, really this idea of sanctuary had kind of remained, and there was one woman, Elvira, that took sanctuary in a Chicago church in 2007, and unfortunately didn't work out very well. She eventually had to return to Mexico. But this idea of someone physically taking sanctuary in a place of worship had not really gone away. And so here in Tucson, in the spring of 2014, there was a family pictured here. Danielle, the father, was facing a final deportation order. And it looked like the only recourse for his family and for him to be able to stay with his family was to physically take sanctuary in our church here, Southside Presbyterian. And so this effort really kind of reignited this movement for churches to stand up and stand with immigrant communities by hosting them in their churches and advocating for their cases to be closed so that they could stay with their families. And primarily at this time, the people who were looking at taking sanctuary were people who had been in this country, lived in our communities for many, many years. For Daniel and his family, he and his wife came here 16 years ago, and they had their son Carlos here in the United States, and we were standing alongside them to demand that the local immigration office close his case so that he could stay with his family in his community. And so he was here in sanctuary for 28 days, and after that time, his legal and strategic team was able to negotiate a stay of removal on his deportation order, and he was able to leave. And so what this work really looked like the past two and a half years is that, like I said, someone like Daniel, who had a final deportation order, would enter sanctuary, and the congregation and community would provide the hospitality to the person and their family. And so since May of 2014, we've had 21 people enter sanctuary, and 16 of those people have been able to win some kind of deportation relief and leave sanctuary. And so while that hospitality is being provided, there's a legal and organizing strategy that's developed to push for deportation relief through prosecutorial discretion. And that's basically the fact that these local immigration offices have the authority to be able to choose and to decide who should be deported and who shouldn't. And that's according to a couple of different memos of the Obama administration that basically laid out what were the priorities for deportation, recognizing that pragmatically on their end, there was no way to deport everyone, and so we have to make choices as to who to be deported. And so things like having strong ties in the community, having U.S. citizen children, having a clean criminal record, a lot of those things we definitely pushed against. We wanted to not just push the Obama administration to follow their own guidelines, but to actually demand not one more deportation. And that not one more Nima Must has been a rallying cry of the undocumented immigrant community for some time. And so through sanctuary, we were able to lift up that cry more, that we don't believe anyone should be separated from their family, from their community, and we're going to stand in the way of immigration, being able to proceed with that. And so really it's important to understand, as our context is changing, and Reverend Allison will be speaking to this more later, that the work we were doing was really this case-by-case advocacy. And it usually happened around somebody's case that did have somewhat of someone that did meet those kind of requirements. At the same time, we did have, and here it is, so to our goal to raise the consciousness of the impact of U.S. immigration policy on immigrant families and communities. And so we were pushing the Obama administration to do what they said that they were going to do, and to really follow through with their commitment to human rights and to protecting communities. And so here we have some pictures of the different people that have entered and left sanctuary over the past 2.5 years. And if you see Francisco in the top left corner, he took sanctuary in and he actually was a person who has a felony conviction on his record. And so in that case, that community was really pushing against these ideas that we should be deporting people who have felonies, that we should doubly punish someone through deportation and separation of their families. And for Francisco, he actually fled here in El Salvador from gang violence when he was young, and had been here 20 years, had started a family. And we believe that he absolutely should be able to stay in Portland with his community, and that a felony conviction shouldn't prevent that. And so these are some other pictures of people that have taken sanctuary. Angela on the right in Philadelphia, Luis on the bottom left in Phoenix, and Arturo in Denver on the bottom right. And then we have in the top left here, Francisco here in Tucson at a Methodist church, and Beatriz on the top right in Chicago, Sulma Franco in the bottom left in Austin, Texas, and finally Misael in the bottom right in Phoenix. And so this is just to show you the variety of people and family situations, of people that have been able to win some kind of relief through this case-by-case advocacy of the resurgence of the sanctuary movement. And particularly, we always like to tell the story, and I'm a little bit biased because I'm here in the Tucson community, of a woman named Rosa Robles Loreto, who took sanctuary here at Southside about 2 months after Daniel did. And she was here for 461 days. And also Reverend Allison Harrington is pictured here. This was the day that Rosa was able to finally leave sanctuary on November 11th, 2015, after 461 days. And as the title suggests here, it took 10,000 Arizonans to stop her deportation, because part of the final tactics of the campaign was to put up, they put up almost 10,000 signs around Tucson that said, "We stand with Rosa." And these signs are everywhere. They're still everywhere, even over a year later. And they were a way to push people to stand alongside Rosa and to continue to get more and more media coverage, and to show the local ICE office that indeed there were thousands of people who were trying to help Rosa go home and be with her family. And so this work has been really important in the past 2.5 years. I think, speaking to what John was saying in terms of the spiritual transformation of those of us who are allies in this work, to really recognize that we have a stake in this too, that to figure out what kind of society we want to live in. Do we want to live in a society where people are constantly being separated from their families, people are being separated from their communities, where we're not honoring the contributions and the value of these people in the image of God who are part of our society and part of our family? And so by declaring sanctuary over the past 2.5 years, we've been able to say, no, we will not let you take away members of our family. And so I think these are important things to remember as we move forward, even under a Trump administration, that indeed we are fighting for our family members, and that's certainly what God calls us to, and what Christ calls us to. And in this time of Advent, with the coming of Christ, may we remember that these are all members of our family who we must stand with and protect.
Thank you, AmyBeth. We're going to turn it over to Jim Rigby now in Austin. And as he is getting his video loaded, I just wanted to remind you to please send in your questions using the chat feature in the control panel of the webinar. So about 5 down, you'll see a menu that says chat. And you can just type in your questions right there as we go along. And we will see those, and they'll be a part of our question and answer at the end. Jim?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm going to try to speak slowly because I know that it causes trouble if you speak too quickly. I had kind of a flashback as I was listening to John speak, because we studied him in seminary, and what struck me was how when you study figures like John, they seem like these anonymous, abstract people, and you think of yourself as sort of a witness to history, sort of a bystander. And the strange experience of meeting John, meeting the people from Arizona that had done that courageous work, and then being invited into that work itself is probably the best thing that ever happened to our church. We've tackled a lot of issues, but there's something about this particular issue that invites Americans out of the bubble that we live, kind of a false history that we're taught, and really a religion that is captive to an empire and captive to an economic system. That when we use the word sanctuary and we talk about a fancy room with stained glass and velvet pews, we can forget that the heart of the message, as several people have said already, is hospitality and a solidarity with the people of the world. The story is not really about St. Andrews. The story is about Hilda and Yvonne, two courageous people from Guatemala, and they were born into a hell there in Guatemala because of policies of our nation that destabilized that area of the world. You see Hilda there. She's, I don't think she's anything close to 5 feet. Her son is even shorter, and somehow our politicians have made us afraid of them, and have had people reacting as though they are somehow threats to us. But they were both born in a hell that was not of their making, and they fled that violence. When they got into Mexico, they were instantly spotted as being indigenous people, and they were threatened and attempted blackmail by gangs there in Mexico. Every kind of abuse that you can think of, Hilda went through, protecting her son, getting up to the United States, where she thought there would be these wonderful Americans waiting with open arms to protect refugees. What she didn't know is that in order to claim that status, you have to cross the line. And as soon as you cross the line, you're considered a criminal in this country. So when people talk about they only want to punish the criminals, there's a duplicity to that. There's a dishonesty to that. And Yvonne is now 10 years old. He has spent 10% of his life in a for-profit prison. We have several of those down here in Texas. We're hopefully shutting them down as we speak. There's Yvonne. He's standing on something. He's nowhere near that tall. But we had a birthday for him over the summer. It was the first birthday he's ever had in his life, which is kind of hard to imagine. A child that has lived with so much fear that and instability that a birthday party would be something that would seem like this incredible luxury. And later on this week, we will be having Hilda's birthday, which I understand will be the first one that she's had as a celebration of any sort. So they had heard about Sulma. You saw the picture of Sulma at the Unitarian Church here in Austin, and that church had taken Sulma in and given her sanctuary. Her situation was very complicated by the fact that she is an advocate for LGBTQ issues, And so she was very much a target, and very much would be being sent back to her death if she was deported. So we had worked with the Unitarian Church, and that introduced us to Ilda. Ilda comes to our door and asks for sanctuary. And if you know your history, if you know the history of what happened in Guatemala, and you know what happens to people in that kind of danger, then the only answer you can have is yes. And for some reason, that's very frightening for churches, but I think it's one of the most life-giving things that could happen to the church. And we tell the story of Christmas, and we cast the figures as these white porcelain figures, and we don't realize that Ilda and Yvonne would very much fit in that nativity scene in terms of people fleeing the violence, trying to find some safe haven in the Christmas story, or Moses standing up to Pharaoh. It's for some reason the church has sided with Pharaoh in our particular generation. So this is an invitation back into the gospel at the heart level, and at the level where the love makes a difference to somebody on the other side of the boundaries. The first day that Ilda and Yvonne moved into our church, I got a call from ICE, and it was kind of scary at first to realize they were trying to push us to say that we wouldn't let them come in. They were trying to get us to make a mistake. And then I realized that I was not talking really to government people. I was talking to the for-profit business that makes money off the manacles that immigrants have to wear when they leave detention. And you just realize how corrupt the entire system is. Her nation was destroyed for profit. They were imprisoned for profit, and they were monitored for profit. So to me, if the gospel has any feet whatsoever in the world, we have to say yes to sanctuary. And I would invite every church to think about it very seriously, because there's nothing more transformative than recognizing the gospel doesn't stop at boundaries. There's nothing more transformative than to really realize that a human value does not come from our place in the capitalist order of things. That when you look at those two faces and you realize the infinite worth that they both have, then you realize it's the rules that have to change. And I love what John says about it's not civil disobedience, because international law demands us to take in people fleeing that kind of violence. And we forget that the United States left international law, left the world courts. So Jesus summarized his teaching as being a good neighbor, and our nation is not being a very good neighbor in the world. And the church is incredibly complicit unless we offer hospitality, unless we redefine sanctuary not as the fancy room, but as a philosophy of hospitality for all people. I would say that this is one of the best things that's happened to our church. It opened a window in our minds so that when we hear about Syria, that's no longer an abstract issue. We are able to look in the face of Ilda and Yvonne and realize that these are real people, and that we need to repent and reform and bring that gospel to the world. So that's my piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And now we're going to hear from Allison Harrington, pastor at Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona. Allison?
Hi, everybody. I'm actually in New York City right now, where it's freezing. I think it's like 80 in Tucson, and it's like 80 below here. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be on this call with you all as we think about in this moment what this work that we're called to is going to look like within this new era that we are entering into. So just to kind of sketch what we think we might be looking at, the likely political changes that might emerge are kind of Trump has said he may undo the Deferred Action Program for Dreamers, DACA. That's a definite possibility. There also could be changes to prosecutorial discretion. AmyBeth mentioned the function of prosecutorial discretion that allows people to advocate on a case-by-case basis for those who should have their cases closed under a particular category. There could be significant changes. And what that basically means is that the avenues that we have to advocate are going to be greatly limited. There also could be changes in the sensitive location memo, and that memo determines that and kind of gives guidelines to the Department of Homeland Security that they should not enter into sensitive locations of houses of worship, hospitals, and schools. That memo actually came out of the sanctuary movement during the Vietnam era, when conscientious objectors were welcomed into churches. Law enforcement actually went into those churches and very violently dragged people out of churches. After the moral outcry in regards to that, they decided maybe that wasn't the best policy. But we're looking ahead to administration that has no shame. And so it may be that will be changed. We definitely think that we are going to see an increase in detention and deportation. Obviously, he has said that will be a priority, and increased criminalization of asylum seekers. We think that all of that, that's some of the landscape that we are looking at. But the reality is that he is a very unpredictable and unstable leader. But the people that he's surrounding himself with aren't unpredictable. There are people that we know well, especially in the state of Arizona. There are people who've actually kind of cut their teeth in this work on our communities. And so we know what they're all about, and they're about extreme nativism and extreme policies of white supremacy that seek to otherize people who don't have white skin. And so we are familiar with them, and so they are predictable to us, and so we're ready. The other thing that is predictable is the community of faith. Like, we're not going to just sit back and say, oh, okay, all these things are okay with us. Like, we know that there is going to be a huge uprising of churches and communities of faith saying this is contrary to our understanding of who we believe ourselves to be as people of faith and as communities of faith. And we've already seen that since the election. I also want to point out that something else happened on Election Day. And what happened on Election Day was that Sheriff Joe Arpaio was defeated. We've talked a lot in the past several years about the Arizonification of America, which is really finally now complete with the election of Trump. But the reality is with the rising nativist movement that has kind of emerged in the past several years, we've also had this rise of undocumented-led organizing, that any win that we've gotten these past few years have been because of their organizing strength. So DACA, getting Joe Arpaio out of office, all of that was the hard work of undocumented community members. And so we're really seeing the Joe Arpaio as like a tipping point, because Joe Arpaio was Trump before Trump was Trump. And communities who were organized got Arpaio out of office. And so we have a lot of hope in the power of an organized community. So in this particular moment, what we're seeing is that this new era is going to require the work of sanctuary to adapt. We must do more than just establishing congregations that are willing to physically house someone. That aspect of sanctuary will always continue to be important. So we still need congregations to be discerning whether they can open their walls, or the walls of their church, their houses of worship, to those who are in threat of deportation or threat of persecution in a number of different ways, whether they're Muslim, whether LGBTQ. But we also have to expand those notions of sanctuary. It needs to be, like Jim was saying, it needs to be this kind of organizing principle to our work. As communities of faith, we need to work alongside those who are most directly affected by the unjust and immoral policies and practices that are going to be emerging. There is this looking, within the national immigrant rights movement, there is this looking to the red states, to the red state veterans, to learn from them and how we survived in the past several years. And so there's been an effort to look at how do you create ICE-free zones, how do you work against detainer policies in local police in local jails? And how do you build infrastructures of protection? And that's a big part of the work that is happening in Tucson and across the nation right now. The undocumented community members are getting together to create what we call protection networks. People call them different things in different areas, but they're basically these organizations of undocumented community members coming together to do know your rights trainings, to do trainings around if you do get picked up, how you represent yourself in a bond hearing. There's legal support that's offered. There's also how do you protect your parental rights if you are detained. So there's these networks of protection that are establishing in a variety of different places to protect people. And it's a form of sanctuary, really. And so churches need to figure out how do we come alongside that organizing in ways that are appropriate, in ways that make sense for us in this moment. So understanding that sanctuary is not just an act of a congregation, but really the work of a community. The faith community should kind of heed these principles. Respect and follow the leadership of directly affected folks. Ask them for what they need. You know, a lot of people are saying, we're ready to do sanctuary, but sanctuary maybe is not what is needed in the moment, but what is needed in the moment is access to a copier so they can make massive flyers or training materials for their meetings, or childcare. That's one of the things we're doing in Tucson is providing childcare, getting Sunday school teachers to provide childcare for parents so they're able to attend these really important meetings. We also need to be steadfast in our adherence to our own faith traditions and speak with authenticity out of those traditions. What is it that personally motivates us as Christians, as Jews, as Muslims, as Sikhs? How do we speak out of our own tradition, and how we find our motivating grounding in that place? I think in this time when we don't know what's going to be happening, we need to be relentlessly imaginative and brave and more courageous than we've ever been. And I think that we also need to pledge our highest allegiance to the mandates of our faith and not to the laws of the land, which is a lesson that we learned coming out of the 1980s. And we certainly need to kind of broaden the concepts of sanctuary and figure out who needs sanctuary. And as communities of faith, we also need to make sure that we are problematizing and understanding the connections between the immigration system and the criminal justice system. Obama has record rates of deportation, by the way. So let's just say we've been through this. It's going to get a lot worse, but it's not like it's been really good. We need to make sure that we're understanding the connections between the immigration system and the criminal justice system. And we need to understand that Trump has said he wants to go after the criminal immigrant. We need to problematize that. We need to understand that, as AmyBeth was saying, people shouldn't be punished twice for criminal convictions that they might have. We need to understand principles of restorative justice mean that people need to stay in the community and not be removed from the community so that healing can happen. And we need to understand that we are not going to buy into the narrative of the good immigrant who is worthy of our protection and our prayers, but that everyone is worthy because everyone is a child of God. So I think that one of the things that we are really encouraging people to do is to discern what they are called to as a congregation. So for pastors who may be on the call, for lay leaders, first make the ground fertile for the work. Preach about justice issues, especially as we are moving into the Advent season or into the Christmas season. You know, listing up the fact that every family is a holy family, and listing up kind of those stories. Understanding that Jesus was a refugee. Jesus had to flee the death squads of Herod, and thank God Obama wasn't Pharaoh. And I do mean Obama because Obama has deported so many people back to horrific situations, and we're glad that Pharaoh in Egypt was kinder than our elected officials because the Holy Family was able to remain in Egypt until it was safe for them to return. We encourage people to engage in prayer. I mean, you know, when Rosa was in sanctuary for 461 days, we had prayer vigils for 461 days, knowing that if we did not stay rooted in our prayer traditions, we would lose heart and we would not be able to continue the work. And then plant the seeds for the work. Engage in congregational education on the issue. Resources are available at sanctuary.deportation.org. And we encourage you to just delve into it. We're also encouraging people to take the Sanctuary Pledge. The URL can be seen there on the screen. And join a local sanctuary coalition. Figure out who in your area is working on these issues. Come together. And so there's kind of two aspects of that work. There's discerning like what you are called to as a congregation within the work of sanctuary. And it may not be that you can house someone, and it may not be that that's even the work ahead, but we need to figure out where are we as a congregation and where are we willing to go? And we need to figure that out now so that when the crisis hits, we don't have to form a committee to figure it out, that we're willing to act and we're willing to move. Because we don't know what's happening, but we need to be ready to move quickly because they're moving quickly. The other thing we need to do is just engage in local work. Figure out who is in your city doing, who are the undocumented, who's doing organizing by affected community folks, and just connect with them. Open up your space in your congregation for meetings to happen. Do childcare, do whatever you can, and ask them, what is it that you need in this moment? And whatever they ask for, do it. It may not be the sexy thing of sanctuary, but whatever it is, fill the gap, see the gap, and fill it. I think that the thing that I want to conclude with is that the work needs to expand. A lot of people are talking about sanctuary, and we just need to expand it as this kind of grounding principle for our work, that we need to create. There's going to be no moral conscience to appeal to in DC, so we need to kind of we need to build a fence of protection, a hedge of protection around our communities. And the only way to do that is not by building a wall, but by building communities that are organized and educated and in relationships of accountability with one another. Because we are very clear that in this moment, the only safe spaces that we are going to find are going to be the ones that we create ourselves.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, everybody, to all our panelists. We're going to move into a time of question and answer, and so if you continue to have questions, please continue to type them in, and we've got a really good list to start with. So I'm going to invite all of our panelists to turn their video back on so that I will read through some of these questions, and if it is a question that you feel like you are ready to answer, I hope that you'll just jump in and we'll get to hear from everybody a little bit more. So Allison, I think what you were saying answered a lot of the questions that people have been typing in throughout of what are the next steps, like how do we start to become a sanctuary church, and how do we prepare ourselves to be sanctuary communities. And you talked a lot about joining local networks where they exist and making connections with immigrant communities that are in our own communities. I wonder if you or anybody else has any other really practical next or first steps for communities to take that haven't been mentioned already.
I just want to emphasize the fact that this work is all local work. It's local. So you have to figure out what is going on in your city and plug into that, and then just start the conversations. There are certain models that are emerging that we didn't mention actually out of Philadelphia, and that's Sanctuary on the Streets, which is a rapid raid response program. So if you want to know more about that, I would go to the website. But I really do think it's being in relationship with people, because what is needed in this moment is not going to come out of our brains. It's going to come out of the collective wisdom of undocumented community members and those who are feeling as if they will be in the crosshairs.
Thank you. We have several questions from folks about around sanctuary cities and what it means to be a sanctuary city, which AmyBeth touched on, of these networks. But what is also the role of a church in a sanctuary city? Can one of you all speak to that?
Yeah,
John, you should take that one.
This is John. We went through that whole process here in Tucson when the police chief decided it was his role to cooperate with federal immigration officials and Border Patrol because it was the law in Arizona. And we kept saying to him, well, there are policies and practices you can put in place that do not cooperate with federal immigration officials, and together with the faith communities of Tucson and the undocumented community, we conducted a campaign for a couple of years, which eventually resulted in the mayor and council retiring the police chief early and hiring someone who understood community policing. And there are some across the United States who have, by unfortunate experience of cooperating with federal immigration officials, discovered that that's very bad police practice and have severed their relationship with federal immigration officials because they have understood that it's so destructive to their prime responsibility, which is to provide for public safety of the whole community. And when you have a significant portion of the community afraid of any contact or cooperation with local police, victims of crimes, folks who are witnesses to crimes, if they're afraid of any contact with local police officials, they can't do their job of providing for the public safety of the whole community. And so that movement is grounded in best police practices and community policing. And faith communities and the undocumented community can form coalitions to make sure that community policing is the policy of your local city or county or police chief or sheriff, and that's a growing movement that you have seen across the United States. So you're on the right side of not only good policing, but good faith practice too.
Thanks, John. And a follow-up question related to that is about folks wondering about how much police and other authorities respect the sanctuary status, or do they seek to enter the church? Sounds like Jim had an experience of hearing from ICE and some pressure from ICE. But I wonder if others of you could speak to those experiences. And then maybe following up, we have a couple other questions about the new administration's policies and promises. But let's first stick to this question about whether or not police and local authorities respect sanctuary status.
I mean,
go ahead, Emily.
I mean, our experience has been that they have done that, and they have been respectful of the spaces. I also want to say that I think that there is a privileging of Christian churches in our nation, and so if a WARA or a mosque were to declare sanctuary, I don't know what law enforcement would do in those situations, and I don't think that we can depend on. I don't think we can depend going forward on the fact that they will. I mean, I think it's likely that they would. But I also think that it brings up another issue that John, that we've been talking about in Tucson a lot, is in this time where we don't know what's coming, one of the best things that we could be doing is training ourselves on nonviolent direct action, so that we are prepared to defend spaces if need be. And so this is a time for really equipping ourselves so that we're able to move and to respond if those spaces aren't respected.
We had a training at our church on a weekend on how to protect Ilda and Yvonne if ICE were to raid during a worship service. And we were going to just do a small modeling of that and have 6 people kind of circle them, and the entire congregation, like right before the benediction, completely circled them. And then others stood at the door just spontaneously thinking through what would be needed in that kind of a situation. So we have the sheriff's department, they park in our parking lot all the time. So we've had conversations, and they're not particularly anxious to get, at least here in Austin, to get involved in that. But the governor in the past and the attorney general have put a lot of pressure and have tried to make it where churches are liable for anything that happens as a result. So I think it's going to be city by city, but I think unless there's pressure from the right, I think most police departments, like John is saying, it's like it's just poor policing to do that. Because it's a federal.
John, one of the things we learned in the 80s was the government never figured out what to do about entire congregations who declare sanctuary. They struggled. They tried all kinds of ideas and never figured it out. And I think our track record recently has been they still haven't figured it out. Now that's not a guarantee, but it's a historic reality that the government just does not know what to do with entire congregations that act together and publicly to stand up for faith and human rights.
And a follow-up question to that is somebody indicated that it's interesting to think about sanctuary in light of the promises that the incoming administration has made that they will institute more religious freedom laws. Is there any way that you all can predict that these laws might actually be used to protect sanctuary churches and communities?
Wouldn't that be nice?
That hadn't worked.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Religion for conservatives, but there's no sense that, at least here in Texas, in terms of reproductive rights and that sort of thing, that it's a balanced view. And I'm sure in this they won't be seeing that as, I mean, religious right is, as somebody said, it's seen as a Christian thing, and by Christian they mean fundamentalist Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I want to maybe put a plug in there for, I think that's definitely true. I think a particular type of religion is the religion being protected. It's the religion of empire, right? But I do want to put a plug. I think that we need to have strategic alliances with our evangelical brothers and sisters, and so there is a different kind of trajectory of this work that is being led by Alexia Salvatierra, who was involved in the movement back in the 1980s and in 2006. And she's working with evangelical churches for those who are afraid of the sanctuary kind of word, she's coming up with the idea of a Matthew 25 pledge. Take this pledge to live faithfully to Matthew 25, and there's going to be this kind of whole ladder of engagement. That actually might be a helpful framework for some congregations to think about, like what does that ladder of engagement look like? Because if you're able to get a congregation to enter into the ladder, they're going to move up. And so maybe it's just having a prayer vigil every week for the new administration, for immigrants, for Muslims, whatever it is, but like start there, and then what are the other ways? Hold forums, have a march, have a press conference. So there's all these ways to engage, and so I think we do need to have some strategic alliances with folks from other traditions.
Just one more note from the 80s. During the 1980s, the government infiltrated our churches with undercover agents and paid informants. And the conclusion of kind of the last action of the sanctuary movement was to sue the government, as that infiltration was a violation of the First Amendment, free exercise of religion clause. And the federal courts declared that it was a violation of the First Amendment and ordered the government never to do that again. So we've got some precedent that protects churches from some government activity in the church.
Yeah, I thought the Patriot Act kind of made new avenues into infiltration of churches. No?
No, that court decision still stands.
Well, they're going to infiltrate us. They're going to be watching us. They're going to do whatever they can to undermine the work, to discredit the work, to make the work quote unquote illegal. but you know, we do stand on the foundations of our faith. And I mean, it was interesting to me. I mean, I think a lot of the work in the 80s was this understanding of like, this is our First Amendment right to practice our faith. And when SB 1070 was signed into law here in Arizona, Southside was part of a lawsuit saying that this is prohibiting us from practicing our faith. And so I think when people ask, you know, is this work, one of the questions we always get is this work legal? Like it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter because our faith tradition calls us to this work. And if we can by our actions somehow put ourselves into the realm of what is now illegal, like we're in better standing because we're closer to the experiences of the poor, and we're closer to that realm of illegality within the empire, which is where we need to be as a people.
Amen.
We've had several questions coming in about touching on what you just responded to, Allison, about whether or not this might jeopardize tax-exempt status. And so it sounds like to me, from what you were saying earlier, that maybe that's not the first step that many congregations would take. And if a congregation is uncomfortable with that, start with a prayer vigil. Not that that's lesser, but it's has different legal implications potentially. And then to see where the Spirit leads that community. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I would say so. But you know, I mean, that tax exempt status was fundamental to the ministry of Christ. So we need to make sure. I mean, come on, like what does it really mean to be church? And I think we need to, like, in this moment, I think the soul of the church is in question right now, like how we're going to respond to this moment. And I get the fact that people in churches are worried about things like the tax exempt status, but I think we need to worry more about our salvation and the fate of our neighbors. So, but I think there's like 87 people on this call. If there's somebody out there who could do a little research on that and get back to us and like let us know, so that when people do ask us that question, we can kind of say, well, here's what we think. That would be great. That's something that somebody could do like today. Start researching that question.
So if anybody wants to research about the question about whether a tax-exempt status would be jeopardized for a church practicing sanctuary, that would be one way to participate in the sanctuary movement.
In Texas, anyway, I've called the Texas Ethics Commission a number of times whenever and it's a lot more about partisan, like supporting certain partisan politicians than it is any policy. Just because a policy is controversial does not mean the tax-exempt status is at stake. I understand that this is like the argument can be made that it's when you're advocating something that isn't legal, that would draw that into question. But I don't know that that may be new ground. I think in the past it's all been about not recommending that people vote for a certain party more than a policy.
Mm-hmm. So we have oh, go ahead, AmyBeth.
If I could just add something, I mean, I think speaking to what Allison was saying, you know, there's a lot of talk that this word sanctuary is getting thrown around a lot with the sanctuary cities, the rising sanctuary campus movement, kind of the existing faith-based sanctuary movement. And I just think it's important to point out that we as people of faith have a unique call to be leaders in this work. And we're certainly supporting the efforts of, you know, local institutions to do as much as they can to protect, you know, to prevent cooperation with immigration enforcement, and for campuses to declare that their students are safe there. But I think we need to really look inside and think about how we should be the ones at the front of this, and if that means that we're labeled, you know, what we're doing as illegal. And I think, you know, John's sitting here next to me, and of course he looked at significant time in jail for the work that he was involved in, and I think that's to what we are called, to stand with the most vulnerable. And I'm glad, in some ways, I'm glad that this election has awakened so many people to the crisis that we're seeing with immigration that's been going on and will continue and get worse, so that we can really be awakened to what our faith demands of us.
Yeah, this is John. I think it's really important in your local congregation to have those conversations about all those anxieties. We did a 3-month process here in 1982 before we declared sanctuary, and we had to, I mean, we brought in folks from the law school and lawyers to talk about all of those issues. And of course, there are no simple answers, but you have to have that conversation with appropriate legal experts in the congregation. We had folks who had security clearances for their job. What did that mean? What did it mean to folks who were getting federal assistance? And all of those kinds of questions have to be talked about and prayed about and studied. And then there's going to be ambiguity because nobody knows what this new context is going to be.
Somebody just asked a question about the Matthew 25 pledge that Allison referred to, and in relation to something that the General Assembly passed this summer about committing to be a Matthew 25 church. And so I just wanted to kind of draw people's attention to the fact that the Presbyterian Church this summer did pass a resolution committing to be a church committed to Matthew 25. And we'll have this resource and all of the resources that we've mentioned will be available through the Synod Network or the Synod of the Northeast Facebook page. But one way that might be an entry point for your congregation or your community into thinking about what it means to be a Matthew 25 church would be through a book that Rick Ufford Chase published earlier this year called Faithful Resistance. I think that has been a good entry point for a lot of churches as they have been wrestling with and trying to find examples of what it looks like to be a Matthew 25 church in this day and age. So this resource and this webinar and all of the other resources that people have mentioned will be on the Synod of the Northeast Facebook page after this webinar. I want to start to wrap us up, and so we'll take a couple more questions.
Emily, can I interrupt?
Sure.
I was the envy of all my colleagues from different denominations during the 1980s because I was a Presbyterian. Presbyterian Church has a whole history of policy support for congregations that do sanctuary. And that culminated again this summer with more than one policy statement in support of Presbyterians and Presbyterian congregations. And so the practice of sanctuary in the Presbyterian tradition has great support from General Assembly and synods and presbyteries.
Thanks, John. Yes, we have a rich history and heritage to draw from and a lot of strength and community going forward. So this question is, I'm just going to read it. It says, my understanding is that part of the sanctuary movement for churches is raising awareness through specific and targeted media campaigns to raise public support and outrage. Especially in rural areas where the Trump movement has unleashed this nativist and racist fury, and where most people in a given community know who is not undocumented, does that make sense in those communities to have an underground sanctuary movement as well? Does that question make sense?
Sure. This is John. It was 5 years ago that I was invited to Wisconsin to a church there that wanted to talk about sanctuary because all those dairy farmers were employing undocumented workers in order on the dairy farms throughout that rural area. And when I started raids, they felt they had to be the church in that context and were struggling with what that meant. What triggered it was one of the dairy farm owners discovered that the undocumented guy he had hired on his farm was a Presbyterian minister from Chiapas, Mexico, right? And so they started a worship community in their church. And then when Ice Trade started, they felt, oh, well, we have to form a phone network throughout this community in the rural area. Everybody know, the dairy farmers and the undocumented workers, that ICE was in the county. And then they actually decided, well, we'll tell all the undocumented families who are working on our dairy farms that they can come to the church for protection, right? So that's what it meant to be sanctuary in that context. Everybody's got to, as Allison said, it's all a matter of your local context and what will work in that. But certainly in rural areas, among farmers who are, many of them who are Presbyterians, it's a need for both the farmer and the workers on the farm.
Thanks.
I just want to add something really quickly. I do think that there is this moral platform that we act from, and that there is the call to transform the hearts and minds of people who have been kind of held hostage by this by the rhetoric that is currently pervading our political discourse. But there also is this term that comes out of the 1980s called conscientious evasion. And there are people who need to do the work quietly for a lot of different reasons. And I think that there will need to be perhaps networks that are established to move particularly vulnerable people to places that might be more safe within our nation, or even further to our brothers and sisters in the North. And so I do think that there's basically a role for everyone. I mean, the work that you're doing, you know, if it's criminal justice work, you should keep doing that work. You shouldn't add immigration to your list. You should look at immigration through the lens of criminal justice. You should be thinking about how the work that you're currently doing is able to kind of respond to this particular moment. So there is a role of the quiet conscious evasion, and there is the role for the more public outcry as well.
And when you do the public part, there's a kind of cover that gives you. In the last year, we had Al Jazeera come to our worship service. We've had the national NPR, the British Independent, and a lot of things from South America. And what happens is that light, that focus, really makes groups like ICE step back a little bit, because that's what they don't want is bad publicity. You know, they would rather do that in the shadows. So I agree 100%. It's both. That a lot of the work is going to have to be. If Trump goes the way it looks, then there's going to have to be an underground movement. But I also think that that this is something where the message does ripple out across the world, I think.
Thank you all. And it sounds like, going back to something that several of you all have mentioned earlier, that one of the best ways to prepare to be able to respond is to be doing anti-racism training and nonviolent direct action training now, going ahead and making connections with maybe other congregations or communities in your local area that are primarily immigrant communities, being aware of other, maybe not religious organizations, but local groups or networks that we can be in touch with and listen to and see how we might be of help when the time comes, but to go ahead and start building those relationships. I just wanted to say also that folks, Allison took you up on your ask to do some of that research and have been typing in about what they found, and that the real danger, well, the focus of the 501c3 status is that organizations cannot campaign for or against candidates, of course, but that the sticky area, if somebody really wanted to go after a congregation or community that was providing sanctuary, is that this policy may have the effect of supporting or opposing a particular candidate. So even if the community was not saying we are against this candidate, to say we are against these policies might then have the necessary result of being against a particular candidate. But it sounds like that has not been an issue for any of the communities that you know about thus far. Is that correct?
Right, correct. But we don't know what lies ahead. I think one of the better questions is, if you lose your 501c3 status, what is your status and how does that impact, what does it mean to like have to pay taxes all of a sudden? And like, we should figure that out too, because like, I mean, I don't think any of us are gonna let the IRS to determine the boundaries of our faith practices. So we should figure out, I mean, if people have time, there's a lot of energy right now. So if people have time, like, what does it look like to lose a 501c3 status? Like, how do you then do fundraising? How, you know, what structures need to be in place?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to wrap us up and move just to the next slide that has a few resources listed. There were a few questions also about legal advocacy networks and stuff like that for communities that are engaging in sanctuary work. And so you can be in touch with the National Sanctuary Movement for some of that, and then also local organizations that are in your community would have answers to that as well. And I also want to make sure that everybody knows and marks on your calendar that the Synod of the Northeast is going to be hosting an in-person training at Stony Point Center, February 10th through 11th. So that's a Friday, starting with lunch and ending on Saturday with lunch. AmyBeth will be there with us, and we'll dig deeper into some of these questions about what it really looks like and how we take these next steps to prepare ourselves to respond when needed. So the registration for that will be available on the Synod website, and I hope that you'll also follow the Synod of the Northeast on Facebook. All of these resources that we have mentioned here on this webinar, as well as the registration for the event in February, will be posted there. And sometime later this afternoon, all of you all who are registered and attending this webinar will get a link to the webinar that you can share widely and use in future conversations with your communities if that's helpful. So we hope that you all will stay in touch, especially through the Synod of the Northeast. I know that not everybody on this webinar is even from the Northeast, and so we are really glad to have folks from all over the country and all over the ecumenical map joining us today. And I want to say a special thank you to John and AmyBeth and Jim and Allison for sharing your wisdom and your energy and your stories with us. I hope that this community that has even begun right now will continue. And I know that the Synod of the Northeast is working hard to make sure that churches that are committed to this work in our area of the country are in touch with each other and able to support each other and learn together. So thank you all so much, and to our panelists, and thank you all, everyone who joined us. I look forward to staying in touch with you and to seeing many of you all on February 10th in Stony Point. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
We would like to thank all our panelists today, and thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar. This webinar has been recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email within a few hours with a link to view the recording. On behalf of the Synod of the Northeast and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye.